The bells of Canterbury Cathedral rang out across a city that had lost half its population to plague, and the sound echoed strangely in streets where grass now grew between cobblestones that had once been worn smooth by the constant passage of thousands of feet. And young William Ashford, standing in his father's empty workshop surrounded by tools that would never again be lifted by the hands that had shaped them, understood for the first time that the world he had been born into no longer existed and would never exist again. The year was 1350, and across Europe those who had survived the Black Death were emerging into a landscape transformed beyond recognition, not just by the bodies buried in mass graves or the empty houses with doors hanging open, but by something more subtle and profound, a silence where there had been noise, an absence where there had been presence, a fundamental reorganization of human society that would shape the continent for centuries to come. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. William was 17 years old, one of 3 children in his family, who had lived when 5 had existed before the plague. His father, a master carpenter who had employed 6 journeymen and 3 apprentices, had died in the terrible summer of 1348, along with 4 of the journeymen, 2 of the apprentices, William's mother, his 2 younger sisters, and somewhere between 30 and 40,000 other residents of Canterbury, though no one had been able to count accurately because the dying had happened too fast and the living had been too few. Now William stood in the workshop that should have been his inheritance, looking at the saws and planes and chisels arranged neatly on their racks at the half-finished chairs and tables his father had been working on when the sickness came, at the dust that had settled over everything during the 2 years the shop had stood empty. He was trying to decide whether to reopen the business, whether he had the skill and knowledge to do the work, whether there were even enough people left in Canterbury to need the services of a carpenter. The silence in the workshop was absolute, broken only by the distant bells and the sound of his own breathing. Before the plague, this space had been filled with noise, the rasp of saws, the tap of hammers, the voices of men calling to each other, arguing about techniques, singing work songs, telling jokes. The workshop had been alive with human activity, a place of creation and commerce and community. Now it was a tomb of sorts, haunted by absences, by the ghosts of men who would never return, by the echo of voices that would never speak again. William felt the weight of all that loss pressing on him, making it hard to breathe, hard to think about the future, hard to imagine doing anything but standing here in the silence and remembering. His uncle Robert found him there as afternoon shadows lengthened across the workshop floor. Robert Ashford had survived the plague along with his wife Margaret and one of his 4 children, a daughter named Alice who was now 15. Robert had been a wool merchant before the plague, moderately successful, trading with Flemish buyers and maintaining a small warehouse near the city gates. He had lost 3 children, his business partner, most of his employees, and nearly everything he had worked 20 years to build. "You can't just stand here forever, William," Robert said, his voice gentle but firm. "The world continues whether we're ready for it or not." William turned to face his uncle, seeing in the older man's lined face a reflection of his own grief and confusion. Robert was 43 years old but looked 60, his hair gone completely white during the plague years, his shoulders permanently stooped as if carrying an invisible weight. "I don't know if I can do this," William said. "Father spent 30 years mastering his craft, building this business. I'm 17. I know the basics, but there's so much I don't know, so much he never had time to teach me." "Then you'll learn as you go," Robert said. "That's what everyone is doing now. The old ways of learning, spending 7 years as an apprentice, another 7 as a journeyman, only then becoming a master, those ways died with the plague. There aren't enough masters left to train people the old way, aren't enough years to wait. We have to improvise, adapt, do the best we can with what we have." Robert walked slowly around the workshop, running his hands over the tools, the workbenches, the stacks of seasoned timber. "Your father was a good man and a skilled craftsman. He would want you to continue his work, to use what he taught you to keep the workshop alive, not as a memorial to him, but as a living thing, evolving, adapting to these new times. What if I fail? William asked. What if I take commissions I can't complete, ruin expensive materials, damage the family reputation? Then you fail, Robert said simply, but you'll probably succeed more often than you fail, and you'll learn from the failures. That's all any of us can do. He paused, looking directly at William. The plague taught us that nothing is guaranteed, that everything can be lost in a moment, but it also taught us that life is precious, that we can't waste it paralyzed by fear of failure. Your father is dead, William. You're alive. Honor him by living, by working, by building something with the time you've been given. The words settled into William like seeds into soil, and he felt something shift inside him, some resistance giving way to acceptance. His uncle was right. Standing in the empty workshop mourning the past accomplished nothing. The only way forward was to begin to work, to try. I'll need help, William said. I can't run this workshop alone. Then hire someone, Robert said. There are journeymen without masters, apprentices whose training was interrupted by the plague. You have this workshop, these tools, the Ashford reputation. You can offer employment, and people will be grateful for it. Over the following weeks, William began the slow process of reopening the workshop. He cleaned thoroughly, organized the tools, sorted through the timber supply, completed or dismantled the unfinished projects his father had left behind. The physical work was therapeutic, gave him something concrete to focus on, helped him take ownership of the space. Through the Carpenters Guild, he found Thomas Blackwell, a journeyman in his early 30s who had lost his master to the plague and had been doing odd jobs for the past 2 years. Thomas was skilled and experienced, knew techniques and shortcuts that William had never learned, and he was grateful for steady employment with a proper workshop, rather than the precarious day labor he'd been surviving on. The plague changed everything, Thomas said on his first day in the workshop, running his hands over a plane, testing its blade for sharpness. Before, a journeyman like me might wait years for a position with a good master, might never get the chance to become a master himself. Now there's more opportunity, but also more uncertainty. Half the masters are dead, half the workshops closed. Those of us who survived have to make our own way. Thomas had his own plague stories, his own catalogue of losses. His wife and 2 children had died within days of each other. His master, a renowned craftsman who had trained dozens of apprentices over 40 years, had died alone in his workshop, surrounded by unfinished commissions he would never complete. Thomas had found him there, slumped over his workbench, and had closed the shop and walked away, unable to bear working in that space filled with ghosts. I thought about leaving Canterbury entirely, Thomas admitted, going to London or even to the continent, starting completely fresh somewhere no one knew me. But everywhere was the same. Everywhere had been touched by the plague. Everywhere was mourning and rebuilding. So I stayed, and I'm glad I did. This workshop feels right. Feels like a place where I can do good work. Together, William and Thomas began taking small commissions, repair work mostly, fixing furniture and making simple items. William was honest with customers about his limited experience, charged modest prices, and worked carefully to ensure quality. Word spread slowly that the Ashford workshop was open again, that young William might not have his father's decades of experience, but was reliable and fair. The economic situation in Canterbury was strange and contradictory. On one hand, there was a severe shortage of skilled labor, carpenters, masons, smiths, weavers, all the crafts that kept a city functioning. This meant that those craftsmen who had survived could charge higher prices and had more work than they could handle. On the other hand, there were fewer customers overall, less total demand because the population had been halved. The result was a kind of boom for skilled workers, even as the overall economy struggled. William found himself charging twice what his father had charged for similar work, and customers paid without much complaint because they had no alternative. This made him uncomfortable at first. It felt like profiting from tragedy. But Thomas pointed out that prices simply reflected reality. Labor is more valuable now because it's scarcer, Thomas explained. Your father worked in a world where there were more craftsmen than work. We work in a world where there's more work than craftsmen. The prices adjust accordingly. That's not exploitation, it's just economics. The wealth distribution in post-plague Canterbury was also highly uneven. Some people who had survived found themselves considerably richer than before, having inherited property from multiple dead relatives. William knew of a wool merchant who had inherited estates from 3 uncles, 2 cousins, and his father-in-law, transforming him from modestly successful to genuinely wealthy. These newly rich individuals spent freely, commissioning elaborate furnishings and construction projects, creating demand for skilled craftsmen. But others had been impoverished by the plague, losing family members who were their primary support. Widows whose husbands had been the breadwinners, orphaned children, elderly people who had depended on children who were now dead. These people struggled in the new economy, often depending on charity or reduced to begging. The social fabric of medieval society was fraying in ways both obvious and subtle. The feudal obligations that bound peasants to lords were weakening as labor scarcity gave peasants bargaining power. The guild regulations that controlled who could practice various trades were being ignored as necessity trumped tradition. The laws that fixed prices and wages were being violated openly as market forces overwhelmed legal restrictions. By 1351, William's workshop was functioning steadily, taking on increasingly ambitious projects as his skills improved and his confidence grew. He hired 2 apprentices, boys of 14 and 15, whose families had survived the plague and who needed trades to learn. William remembered his own early training with his father and tried to be the kind of teacher his father had been, patient but demanding, encouraging but honest. The apprentices, John and Robert, lived in the workshop, as was traditional, sleeping in a small room above the main workspace, taking their meals with William at his uncle's house. They were eager learners, grateful for the opportunity to acquire valuable skills in a world where such opportunities were scarcer than before the plague. William watched them work and saw reflections of his younger self, remembered the excitement of learning to use tools properly, the satisfaction of completing a project well, the gradual accumulation of skills and knowledge that transformed a novice into a craftsman. Teaching them helped him understand how much he had actually learned from his father, how much knowledge had been transferred in those years before the plague. In 1352, William married. Her name was Emma Carpenter, which made some people smile at the appropriateness of a carpenter marrying a woman named Carpenter, though the name came from her father's profession rather than being a coincidence. Emma was 20 years old, the daughter of another master carpenter who had survived the plague, and the marriage was partly a strategic alliance between 2 surviving craftsman families. But it was also more than that. William and Emma had known each other before the plague, had been reintroduced by their fathers who were guild colleagues, and had developed genuine affection during their courtship. Emma was intelligent and capable, literate, unusual for a woman of her class, and skilled in household management. She understood the carpenter's trade from growing up in her father's workshop, and could discuss wood grain and joinery with knowledge that impressed William. "We adapt or we fail," William argued at one meeting. "The world has changed. We can't pretend it hasn't. He can't insist on doing things the way they were always done when the way they were always done is no longer possible. I learned what I could from my father before he died. I've learned more from Thomas and from experience. Am I as skilled as a master with 30 years of experience? No, but I'm competent. I do good work, and I'm getting better. That has to be enough, because it's all we have." His words carried weight because they were obviously true, because everyone in the room understood that the old ways were gone and not coming back. The guild reluctantly agreed to continue the relaxed standards, at least temporarily, at least until the situation stabilized further. In 1355, Emma gave birth to a son they named Thomas after William's father. This birth was easier than the first, and the baby was healthy and strong. William felt his household growing, felt himself becoming the head of a family in a way that connected him to all the generations that had come before, all the fathers and grandfathers who had raised children and passed on their knowledge and values. He thought often about what he wanted to teach his children beyond the practical skills of carpentry. What values? What understanding of the world? What lessons from the plague years? How could he help them make sense of living in a world diminished by catastrophe? A world where a third to half of Europe's population had died in a few terrible years. Emma had strong opinions about this. We don't hide the truth from them, she said, but we also don't let it consume them. They need to know what happened, need to understand the world they've inherited, but they also need to know that life goes on, that there's still beauty and goodness, that their lives can have meaning and purpose despite the losses. William agreed, though he struggled with the balance. How much grief was appropriate? How much should they remember versus move forward? These questions had no clear answers, and different families found different balances. Some tried to recreate pre-plague normality as much as possible, rarely speaking of the dead or the terrible years. Others seemed trapped in mourning, unable to move beyond the losses. The Ashford household tried for a middle path, remembering the dead through stories and prayers, maintaining connections to the past, but also firmly focused on building the future, on creating new happiness alongside the old sorrows. By 1356, William's workshop had expanded again. He had hired a second journeyman, a man named Peter who had worked in York before the plague and had wandered south looking for opportunities. Peter brought different techniques and approaches from the northern tradition of carpentry, and the exchange of knowledge between him and Thomas enriched the workshop's capabilities. The two apprentices, John and Robert, were now skilled enough to handle basic projects independently, which freed William and his journeyman to focus on more complex work. The workshop was productive and profitable, one of the most successful in Canterbury, with a reputation for quality and reliability that brought steady commissions. William had also begun taking on larger projects beyond simple furniture. He was hired to help with the renovation of a merchant's house, doing all the interior woodwork, floors, paneling, stairs, built-in cabinets. The project took months and required coordinating with masons and plasterers, managing a complex workflow, maintaining quality standards across diverse tasks. This kind of large-scale work was more challenging, but also more satisfying than making individual pieces of furniture. William felt he was contributing to rebuilding Canterbury in a tangible way, creating structures that would last for generations, putting his mark on the physical city. The merchant who commissioned the work was Geoffrey Marlowe, one of those who had emerged from the plague years considerably wealthier. Geoffrey had inherited property from multiple relatives and had used that wealth to expand his trading operations, diversify his investments, and establish himself as one of Canterbury's leading citizens. The plague created opportunities as well as tragedies, Geoffrey told William one day as they reviewed plans for the paneling. I don't say that to minimize the suffering. I lost family too, people I loved. But it's also true that the massive transfer of wealth that occurred has enabled some of us to build and invest in ways that would have been impossible before. William found this perspective troubling, this frank acknowledgement that some had benefited economically from the plague. But he could not deny its truth. His own workshop had prospered in part because the shortage of craftsmen had driven up wages and prices. The very commission he was working on existed because Geoffrey had inherited wealth from dead relatives. The moral complexity of this bothered William, made him uncomfortable with his own success. But Emma, as usual, offered a more pragmatic view. The wealth exists whether we profit from it or not, she said. The dead can't use it. The question is what the living do with it. Geoffrey could hoard his inheritance or waste it on frivolities. Instead, he's investing in rebuilding Canterbury, hiring craftsmen, creating employment. That seems like a reasonable use of resources, but it feels like we're building on graves, William said. Like our prosperity is founded on mass death. All human prosperity is built on death, Emma replied. Every generation inherits from the previous one, inherits land and wealth and knowledge that exists only because previous generations lived and died. The plague just made that process more visible, more concentrated in time. But the basic pattern isn't different. Her words helped William make peace with his situation, though uneasily. He resolved to use his prosperity well, to be generous with those less fortunate, to contribute to rebuilding not just physically through his carpentry, but also socially through charity and community involvement. In 1357, the Ashford household grew again with the birth of another daughter named Alice, after William's surviving cousin. William was now 24 years old, a master craftsman with a thriving business, a wife, 3 children, employees who depended on him. He had achieved a security and status that would have taken decades to reach before the plague, if he could have reached it at all. But he also felt the weight of responsibility more heavily, the awareness that he was no longer primarily responsible only for himself, but for a household of dependents, for the livelihoods of his employees, for maintaining standards and reputation. His decisions mattered not just to him, but to many others. And this awareness made him more cautious, more conservative in some ways, even as he pushed boundaries in his craft. The guild politics continued to be fractious through the mid-1350s. The older masters who had survived the plague remained uneasy about the rapid changes in how crafts were practiced and regulated. They pushed for stricter enforcement of quality standards, for longer training periods, for restoration of traditional hierarchies. But the younger masters, those like William who had advanced quickly due to plague-created opportunities, resisted these efforts to turn back the clock. They argued that the new system was working, that quality had not declined significantly, that the flexibility was necessary given the ongoing labor shortage. The debates sometimes became heated, with accusations of selfishness and incompetence flying both directions. William tried to be a moderating voice, acknowledging legitimate concerns while defending necessary adaptations. But he found guild politics exhausting and frustrating, time spent arguing that could have been spent working. Across Europe in the late 1350s, similar tensions were playing out in cities and guilds between those who wanted to restore the pre-plague social and economic order, and those who had benefited from the changes and wanted to preserve them. In some places, these tensions would eventually explode into violence. The Jacquerie in France in 1358, later the Peasants' Revolt in England, urban uprisings in German cities. But in Canterbury in 1357, the conflicts remained mostly contained within legal and political channels, expressed through guild meetings and petitions to city authorities rather than open violence. The city had suffered enough during the plague years, and there was little appetite for additional conflict. William focused on his work and his family, tried to stay out of the larger political conflicts, but he could not entirely avoid taking positions. As a master employing workers, he had interests that sometimes aligned with employers and sometimes with workers. As someone who had benefited from the post-plague changes, he wanted to preserve those changes, while also recognizing some legitimacy in concerns about declining standards. His workshop continued to thrive through 1358 and into 1359. He was now taking on prestigious commissions, working for the wealthiest families in Canterbury, creating pieces that were genuine works of art as well as functional furniture. His reputation had spread beyond Canterbury, and he occasionally received commissions from clients in London or other cities who had heard of his skill. This success brought satisfaction but also pressure. The expectations for his work were higher, the scrutiny more intense. A master craftsman of his reputation could not afford mistakes or substandard work. Every piece that left his workshop reflected on him, on his family name, on his workers, on his training and skill. William developed something of a perfectionist streak, rejecting work that did not meet his standards, making his apprentices and journeymen redo pieces until they were right, spending extra hours on details that most customers would never notice. This attention to quality served him well professionally, built his reputation further, but it also wore on him, made him anxious and sometimes irritable. Emma noticed the strain and tried to moderate it. "You're doing excellent work, William. You don't have to be perfect. Good enough is often good enough. But I want to be the best," William said. "I want our workshop to be known for the highest quality, for work that sets the standard others aspire to." "And you're achieving that," Emma said, "but not at the cost of your health and peace of mind. You can be excellent without being obsessive. Your father was an exceptional craftsman, but he also knew when to stop, when a piece was done, even if it could theoretically be improved further." William tried to take her advice to find better balance, but it was difficult. He had internalized high standards from his father's teaching and from the guild's emphasis on quality. And in the post-plague world, where so much traditional craft knowledge had been lost, He felt a responsibility to maintain standards, to preserve quality, to prove that the next generation could be as skilled as those who had died. The apprentices John and Robert completed their training in 1359 and were formally recognized as journeymen, allowed to work independently, though they chose to remain with William's workshop rather than seeking positions elsewhere. This was gratifying to William, validation that he was a good master worth working for, that his workshop provided opportunities worth staying for. With the apprentices now journeymen, William took on 2 new apprentices, younger boys of 12 and 13, continuing the cycle of training that would ensure the craft continued into the next generation. He taught them the same way his father had taught him, patiently but demandingly, explaining not just how but why, building understanding of principles rather than just rote memorization of techniques. A good craftsman understands his materials, William told them, echoing words his father had spoken to him. Wood is alive in its way, has grain and character, responds differently depending on how it was cut and dried and treated. You have to learn to read wood, to understand what it wants to be, to work with it rather than against it. The boys listened with the same mix of fascination and confusion William remembered feeling when his father had first explained these concepts. It would take years for them to truly understand, years of hands-on experience and accumulated failures and successes. But the foundation was being laid, the knowledge passed on, the tradition continued. As 1360 began, William was 27 years old, approaching middle age by medieval standards, though hopefully with many productive years ahead of him. He had survived the plague, built a successful business, raised a family, contributed to rebuilding Canterbury. He had accomplished things his 17-year-old self, standing in the empty workshop 10 years ago, would not have imagined possible. The silent decade was ending, though people did not call it that yet. The label would come later, from historians looking back, but there was a sense among survivors that a phase was concluding, that the immediate post-plague period of shock and frantic adjustment was giving way to something more stable and sustainable. Canterbury in 1360 looked different from Canterbury in 1350, but it also looked different from Canterbury in 1348, before the plague. It was a smaller city in population, contracted in physical footprint, but in some ways more prosperous per capita. The survivors had inherited wealth and property, had opportunities for advancement that would have been impossible in the pre-plague world, had agency and mobility that challenged traditional hierarchies. The cathedral still dominated the city's skyline, still drew pilgrims despite the reduced numbers, still served as the symbolic heart of the community. The market still operated, though with fewer stalls. The streets still bustled, though with less density. The churches still held services, though the pews were less full. Life continued, adapted, found new patterns. William's workshop continued its work, continued training apprentices, continued producing fine furniture and carpentry. It was one enterprise among many, one small part of the great human project of rebuilding, of continuing, of refusing to let catastrophe have the final word. But the decade had changed William in ways he was still discovering, had shaped his worldview and values in fundamental ways. He lived with a double consciousness, present in his daily life but always aware of mortality and impermanence, engaged with his work, but never forgetting how quickly it could all be lost, loving his family, but haunted by the knowledge of how many families had been destroyed. This consciousness was common among the survivor generation. This awareness of fragility underneath apparent stability, this inability to ever quite take anything for granted. They had seen the world end and begin again, and they could never return to the innocent assumption that things would always continue as they were. Emma understood this because she shared it, carried her own double consciousness, her own memories of the plague years. They didn't talk about it much. There was little point in dwelling on shared trauma, but it was there between them, a common ground of experience that shaped how they approached life and parenting and work. "We teach them resilience," Emma said one evening as they watched their children playing in the workshop courtyard. "We teach them that the world is uncertain and sometimes terrible, but also that human beings can survive and rebuild and find meaning even after catastrophe. That's the lesson of these years, isn't it? Not that life is safe, it isn't, but that we can bear what we have to bear. William nodded, watching his son Thomas, now 5 years old, stacking pieces of scrap wood, building structures and knocking them down, absorbed in simple play. The boy had no memory of the plague, had been born into this new world and knew nothing else. In some ways that was a blessing. He carried no direct trauma, no memories of mass death, no personal experience of catastrophe. But it also meant forgetting, meant letting go of the world that had existed before the plague, meant accepting the diminishment as normal. And William felt conflicted about that, wanting his children to be free from the burdens he carried, but also wanting them to remember, to understand what had been lost, to value what they had in the context of what could be lost. The decade had also brought unexpected silver linings alongside the tragedies. The massive population loss had resulted in higher wages for workers, better conditions for peasants, more opportunities for advancement regardless of birth status. The rigid social hierarchies of medieval Europe had been loosened, if not broken entirely, creating mobility that had been nearly impossible before the plague. Women had gained somewhat more independence and agency in the post-plague world, often out of necessity as they took on roles previously held by dead husbands or fathers. Guilds that had excluded women were sometimes forced to accept them. Businesses that had been family enterprises sometimes ended up run by widows who proved as capable as their late husbands had been. Emma's cousin had taken over her late husband's textile business and was running it successfully, earning respect from other merchants and guild members. This would have been scandalous before the plague, but now it was accepted as necessary adaptation to circumstances. The old rules about women's proper roles had not disappeared, but they had been bent and sometimes broken by practical necessity. Their wedding took place in Canterbury Cathedral, a smaller affair than weddings had been before the plague. There were simply too few people left for large celebrations to feel festive rather than melancholy. But it was still joyful, still a celebration of life continuing, still a statement that the world would go on despite everything. Emma moved into rooms William had prepared above the workshop, and together they began building a household. She took over management of the business accounts, tracked commissions and payments, dealt with suppliers and customers when William was absorbed in his work. She also began transforming the living quarters from bachelor simplicity to something more comfortable and domestic. "We're building something new," Emma said one evening as they sat together after supper, reviewing accounts by candlelight, not trying to recreate what existed before the plague, but creating something appropriate to these new times. "Your father's workshop was one thing. Ours will be something else, shaped by different circumstances." William appreciated her pragmatism, her forward-looking perspective. Emma had lost her mother and 3 siblings to the plague, carried her own griefs and traumas, but she refused to be paralyzed by them. She was determinedly focused on the future, on building a life and a family, on participating in the great work of reconstruction that occupied all the survivors. By 1353, Canterbury had begun to stabilize somewhat from the immediate chaos of the plague years. The population had settled at roughly half its pre-plague level, about 40,000 people instead of 80,000. The city had formally abandoned some neighborhoods, their buildings demolished or left to decay, the inhabited core contracting to a more manageable size. The economic disruptions were moderating as supply and demand found new equilibria. Wages remained higher than before the plague, but had stopped their dramatic rise. Prices had similarly stabilized. The frantic activity of the early 1350s, when there had been more work than workers and more money than goods, was calming into something more sustainable. William's workshop was thriving, employing Thomas and the 2 apprentices, taking on projects that ranged from simple furniture to elaborate carpentry for wealthy customers. William had discovered he had a talent for decorative work, for carving and inlay, for creating pieces that were beautiful as well as functional. This artistic dimension of carpentry gave him particular satisfaction, a sense that he was creating something meaningful that would outlast him. One of his major commissions in 1353 was a set of choir stalls for a church that was being rebuilt after fire damage. The work required precision and artistry. Hundreds of individual pieces that had to fit together perfectly, carved decorations that needed to be consistent across multiple stalls. William worked on the project for months, often late into the evening, driven by the challenge and the vision of what the finished work would look like. Thomas handled most of the basic furniture commissions while William focused on the choir stalls, and the apprentices assisted both of them, learning by doing, gradually accumulating the skills that would eventually make them journeymen and perhaps masters in their own right. Emma gave birth to their first child in the autumn of 1353, a daughter they named Margaret after William's mother. The birth was difficult. Childbirth was always dangerous in medieval times, and Emma's sister had died in childbirth 2 years earlier, but both mother and daughter survived. William held his infant daughter and felt a complex mixture of joy and terror, love and fear, hope and anxiety about bringing new life into a world that had proven so dangerous. "She's beautiful," Emma said, exhausted but smiling. "She's going to live, William. Not everyone who is born will die of plague. The world continues. Life continues." William wanted to believe that, wanted to trust that his daughter would have a future, that the plague was over rather than simply dormant, that they were building something that would last. But he could not quite shake his fear, his awareness of how quickly everything could be lost, how fragile all human endeavors ultimately were. The plague had not returned to Canterbury since the terrible summer of 1348, but it remained present elsewhere in Europe, flaring up in different cities and regions, killing in smaller numbers, but still killing a reminder that the disease had not vanished, but only retreated. Travelers brought news of plague in Paris, in Florence, in German cities, and each report sent a chill through communities that remembered what the plague could do. But as 1354 began, life in Canterbury continued its gradual return to something approaching normality. Markets operated regularly, churches held services, festivals were celebrated, the rhythms of urban life reasserted themselves. The city was smaller and quieter than it had been, marked by absences that everyone felt, but that were becoming familiar rather than shocking. William turned 21 that year, still young, but no longer feeling young, aged by responsibility and loss beyond his years. He was a master craftsman now in all but formal recognition, employing workers, taking major commissions, earning a solid income. The guild had waived some of its traditional requirements given the circumstances, allowing him to operate as a master without the usual lengthy apprenticeship and journeyman period. His workshop had become something of a model for how the craft guilds were adapting to post-plague realities. The old rigid hierarchies and lengthy training periods were being compressed or eliminated entirely out of necessity. Young men like William were stepping into roles that would have been impossible for them before the plague, and they were generally proving capable of handling them. But this rapid advancement troubled some of the older guild members, those few master craftsmen who had survived the plague and who worried that standards were declining, that the traditional quality of English craftsmanship was being sacrificed to expediency. They pushed for maintaining the old regulations, the old waiting periods, the old hierarchies. William attended guild meetings where these debates played out, listening to older masters argue that 7 years of apprenticeship was necessary to truly learn a craft, that allowing young men to become masters after only a few years of training would lead to poor work and damaged reputations. But the practical reality was that there were not enough experienced masters left to train apprentices the old way. Were not enough years to wait for the slow traditional process to produce new craftsmen. "The world my daughters will grow up in may be different from the world I grew up in," Emma observed. More possibilities, fewer restrictions. The plague destroyed much, but it also destroyed some of the structures that limited people, especially women. If we're wise, we'll preserve the new opportunities rather than trying to restore the old limitations. William agreed, though he knew many did not share this view, particularly among the older generation and traditional authorities. The attempts to restore pre-plague social and economic arrangements were ongoing, expressed through sumptuary laws meant to prevent lower classes from dressing above their station. through labor laws meant to fix wages and restrict movement, through guild regulations meant to preserve traditional hierarchies. But these efforts were largely failing, unable to overcome the economic realities created by the population collapse. You could pass laws fixing wages, but if workers could get higher wages elsewhere, the laws were meaningless. You could try to restrict social mobility, but if traditional hierarchies had been decimated by death, new people had to fill the vacant positions. The decade had been a massive involuntary experiment in social reorganization, demonstrating that structures that had seemed natural and inevitable were actually contingent and changeable. This was disturbing to those invested in the old order, but liberating to those who benefited from the new arrangements. William found himself increasingly sympathetic to arguments for preserving the changes, for building on the new foundations rather than trying to restore the old ones. He had benefited personally from the new system, his rapid advancement to master craftsman, his successful business, his prosperity, but he also believed the changes were generally positive, creating a society somewhat less rigid and more merit-based. These were radical thoughts for the time, threatening to established powers and traditional authorities, but they were thoughts increasingly common among survivors, particularly younger ones like William, who had come of age in the post-plague world and had no personal stake in preserving the old system. By the spring of 1360, William's workshop was working on its most ambitious project yet, the woodwork for a new guild hall being built to replace one that had burned during the plague years. The project required coordinating with multiple other crafts, managing a complex timeline, producing hundreds of precisely fitted pieces. It was the kind of commission that established a craftsman's reputation permanently, that demonstrated capability at the highest level. William threw himself into the work with the intensity he brought to all major projects, spending long hours in the workshop, sketching designs, supervising every detail. Thomas and the other journeymen handled much of the actual execution, but William checked everything, approved every piece, made adjustments and corrections as needed. Emma worried about him during these intensive periods, worried he was working too hard, sacrificing his health to his ambition. But she also understood that this was how he made sense of his life, how he contributed to something larger than himself, how he honored his father's memory and his own survival. "This guild hall will stand for centuries," William said when Emma urged him to rest more. "Long after I'm dead, craftsmen will gather in this space I helped create. That matters to me, means something beyond just earning money or building a reputation. I want to leave something permanent, something that says I was here, I survived, I built something worthwhile." This desire for permanence, for legacy, was another common feature of the survivor generation. Having witnessed so much death, so much destruction, they wanted to create things that would last, that would outlive them, that would testify to their existence and contribution. Buildings and books, children and craftsmanship. These were ways to achieve a kind of immortality, to leave marks on the world that would persist after individual lives ended. The Guildhall project continued through the summer and into autumn of 1360. William worked alongside his journeymen, his hands still as skilled as theirs despite his master status, still taking satisfaction from the physical work of shaping wood into beautiful and functional forms. On a crisp October morning, as the Guildhall project neared completion, William stood in the empty great hall and looked around at the paneling and ceiling beams, the carved decorations and fitted joinery, the fruits of months of intensive labor. The space was beautiful, dignified, appropriate to its civic function. It was work he could be proud of, work that justified the years of training and effort, work that contributed to rebuilding Canterbury. Thomas came to stand beside him, also surveying the finished work. "Your father would be proud," he said quietly. "This is master-level work, as good as anything I saw before the plague. You've honored his training, proved yourself worthy of the Ashford name." William felt emotion rising in his throat, unexpected and powerful. "I wish he could see it," he managed to say. "Wish he could have been here to guide me through the difficult parts, to teach me what I had to learn on my own." "He is here," Thomas said. "In your skills, in your standards, in your approach to the work. Everything he taught you is embodied in this." He gestured at the hall around them. "That's what it means to be a master. Not just personal skill, but the ability to pass on knowledge, to train others, to contribute to the tradition that extends before and beyond your individual life. As 1360 drew to a close, the silent decade was definitively ending. 10 years had passed since the plague's immediate impact had subsided. 10 years of adjustment and rebuilding, 10 years of learning to live in the changed world. The decade had been marked by silence in the sense of absence. Absent people, absent voices, empty spaces where there had been activity, but also by the gradual breaking of that silence as life reasserted itself. Canterbury was no longer the city it had been before the plague, would never again be that city, but it was a functioning city nonetheless, smaller but viable, diminished but not destroyed, marked by its recent history, but not entirely defined by it. Life continued, work continued. Children were born and raised, businesses operated, buildings were built. William's workshop stood as one example among many of how survivors had taken what remained after catastrophe and built something new from it. The workshop was not his father's workshop reconstructed. It was something different, shaped by different circumstances, adapted to different conditions, continuing a tradition while also evolving beyond it. The children growing up in 1360, Canterbury knew nothing of the pre-plague world, had no personal memories of the catastrophe, inherited the changed world as their normal reality. Margaret was 7 years old now. Thomas was 5. Alice was 3. They would grow up in a world shaped by the plague but not directly traumatized by it, would build their own lives on the foundations the survivor generation had laid. William watched them and wondered what stories they would tell their own children someday, how they would describe this decade of rebuilding, whether they would understand what had been lost and regained, whether the plague would be living memory or already becoming history. Emma's answer when he shared these thoughts with her was characteristically practical. They'll tell their own stories, make their own meanings. We can't control how they'll remember or what they'll understand. All we can do is live our lives as well as we can, teach them what we think matters, and trust that something of value will be passed on. As the year 1361 began, William turned 28 years old, firmly established as one of Canterbury's leading craftsmen, prosperous and respected, a family man with a growing household and a thriving business. The workshop employed 6 people now, 3 journeymen and 3 apprentices, and was taking commissions from across southeastern England. But William had not forgotten standing in the empty workshop 10 years earlier, 17 years old and overwhelmed, unsure whether he could continue his father's work, uncertain about the future. That young man still lived somewhere inside him, still felt the weight of loss and responsibility, still doubted his adequacy to the tasks before him. The difference was that the 28-year-old William had a decade of success behind him, had proven to himself and others that he was capable, had earned his place through work and dedication and continuous learning. He was no longer the uncertain youth standing in the empty workshop, but he remembered being that youth, carried that memory as part of who he had become. The Canterbury of 1361 was more stable and prosperous than the Canterbury of 1351, but it was still a city rebuilding, still marked by empty spaces and absent voices, still living with the consequences of the plague years. The recovery would continue for decades, for generations, as the population slowly grew again, as economic and social systems stabilized, as the trauma gradually receded into history. William's role in that recovery was small in the grand scheme. One craftsman, one workshop, one family contributing to the collective effort of rebuilding and continuing. But small contributions accumulated, multiplied across thousands of workshops and families, created the gradual renewal of European civilization after catastrophe. In his workshop on a winter morning, William stood at his workbench with a piece of oak before him, planning the cuts that would transform it into part of a table commissioned by a wealthy merchant. The wood was solid and real under his hands. The tools were familiar and well maintained. The work ahead of him was clear and achievable. This was what he knew how to do, what gave his life structure and meaning, what connected him to his father and to all the carpenters who had come before, what he would pass on to his children and apprentices who would come after. The plague had tried to break this chain of knowledge and tradition, had succeeded in breaking many such chains across Europe, but some had survived, had been maintained by people like William, who refused to let catastrophe have the final word. He picked up his saw and began to work. The familiar rhythm of blade through wood, the satisfaction of clean cuts and precise measurements, the gradual transformation of raw material into something shaped and purposeful. Outside the workshop, Canterbury was waking to another winter day. Smoke rising from chimneys, people beginning their daily work, the city living and functioning despite everything. The silent decade had passed, and what followed would be shaped by how survivors like William chose to use the time they had been given, how they chose to rebuild and create and continue. The choices made in these years would echo forward through generations, would help determine what kind of world emerged from the plague years, what lessons would be learned or forgotten, what traditions would be preserved or abandoned. William could not see that future, could not know how history would judge this decade of rebuilding, could not predict what would come next for Canterbury or England or Europe, but he could work with care and skill, could treat his employees fairly, could raise his children with love and wisdom, could contribute his piece to the great collective project of human continuation. And so he worked through that winter morning and into the afternoon, surrounded by the sounds of his workshop, the rasp of saws, the tap of hammers, the voices of his journeymen and apprentices, the signs of life and activity and creation. The silence had been broken and the world continued, and William Ashford was part of that continuing, one craftsman among many, one voice among thousands, one small light among the many lights that together pushed back the darkness and insisted that life, despite everything, was worth living and worth building for. The decade had taught him that catastrophe could be survived, that loss could be borne, that meaning could be found even in the aftermath of tragedy. These were hard lessons, learned at terrible cost, but they were valuable nonetheless, would serve him and his generation as they navigated whatever challenges lay ahead. As evening approached and the winter light faded, William lit candles in the workshop and continued working, his hands moving with practiced confidence through tasks he had performed thousands of times, creating something useful and beautiful from simple materials and accumulated skill, participating in the ancient human tradition of craftsmanship, adding his small contribution to the great edifice of human culture and civilization that persisted across generations despite all the forces that worked to destroy it. The silent decade was ending, but the work continued, the tradition continued, life continued, and William Ashford, master carpenter of Canterbury, survivor of the plague, father and husband and teacher and craftsman, was part of that continuation, one thread in the great tapestry of human persistence and resilience and hope.